Something has been quietly escalating across the web throughout 2025 and into 2026, and it affects a population of users that most websites do not bother tracking and that most analysts do not bother counting. Linux desktop users, at the moment of writing this, are finding themselves increasingly unable to complete normal web interactions. Banking sites that require them to use a supported browser, and that define supported browser as Chrome, Edge, or Safari, on Windows or Mac OS. Government portals that rely on proprietary single sign-on systems that do not function on Linux. Streaming services that demand specific DRM capabilities that Linux browsers do not have. Anti-fraud systems that flag Linux traffic as high risk by default and challenge it with CAPTCHA loops that sometimes do not complete. Corporate portals that require specific VPN clients that exist only for Windows. The aggregate effect is that a Linux desktop user, in 2026, encounters meaningful internet friction in a way that was less common 5 years ago. The web, in a real sense, is becoming less accessible to users who have chosen to run an open operating system. I want to walk you through what is actually happening, why it is happening, and what can be done about it. Let me start with the concrete examples, because the abstract complaint is not as useful as the specific cases. Banking is one of the most common friction points. A Linux user in North America, Europe, or Australia, attempting to log into their bank's website using Firefox or a Chromium-based browser on Linux, will encounter, with surprising frequency, a message saying the browser is not supported, or that additional verification is required, or that certain features will be disabled. Sometimes the warning is cosmetic and the site works anyway. Sometimes critical functions, like transferring funds or updating account information, are blocked. The underlying reason is that banks, under regulatory pressure to prevent fraud, deploy anti-fraud systems that use device fingerprinting. Linux desktops produce fingerprints that these systems have been trained to treat as suspicious, because the training data was drawn from a web population in which Linux desktops are a tiny minority, and in which, coincidentally, many automated fraud tools also use Linux. The legitimate Linux user pays the cost of a correlation that says little about them individually. Government websites have their own set of problems. The United States government's login.gov system works reasonably well on Linux. Various European government portals work. But the picture gets more complicated in jurisdictions where government services have been built on proprietary stack assumptions. Some Asian and Middle Eastern government portals require ActiveX controls, which have not been supported by any modern browser for years, meaning the portals technically work only on Internet Explorer 11, which itself is out of support. Some require specific security tokens that ship with Windows drivers and have no Linux equivalent. Some require signed PDFs generated by specific Adobe products that do not run on Linux. Each of these cases is a pocket of the internet that is effectively closed to Linux users, even though the rest of the web remains open. Video streaming, as I covered in a previous video, is a known friction area. The DRM limitations that cap Linux users at 720p SAO for Netflix, that create playback failures on Hulu, and that effectively lock Linux users out of Apple TV Plus are part of a pattern where streaming services treat Linux as a second-class platform at best. Corporate applications are another category. Remote work and VPN tools that ship with Windows clients, Mac clients, and sometimes mobile apps often do not ship with Linux clients. The specific case of Cisco AnyConnect, the most common enterprise VPN client, does have a Linux version, but it has historically been buggy and poorly supported compared to the Windows version. SaaS products that require specific client-side components, like certain remote desktop systems, time tracking tools, or collaboration platforms, have uneven Linux support that ranges from excellent to non-existent. A Linux user working in a corporate environment can usually find workarounds, but the workarounds take effort, and they are never as smooth as the Windows default. CAPTCHA challenges are a particularly frustrating category. Google's reCAPTCHA, which is the dominant bot detection system on the web, uses browser fingerprinting as part of its decision-making. Linux users are more likely to be presented with harder CAPTCHA challenges, and more likely to have those challenges fail silently without clear explanation. A Firefox user on Linux, who is also using privacy extensions, like uBlock Origin or Privacy Badger, can find themselves in a situation where reCAPTCHA challenges reliably fail regardless of how many times they click through the puzzle. Cloudflare's Turnstile, a similar antibot system, has been reported to produce similar behavior for Linux traffic. The cumulative effect of all these individual friction points is that using the web as a Linux desktop user has become meaningfully harder over the last 3 years, and the trend is in the wrong direction. Why is this happening? There are several overlapping reasons. The first is that the web has been moving toward more client-side capability requirements. Modern web applications do more work in the browser than they used to, using technologies like WebAssembly, WebRTC, advanced media APIs, and platform-specific integrations. Each of these capabilities is implemented in each browser, and the quality and completeness of the implementations vary. Firefox and Chromium-based browsers on Linux implement most of these capabilities, but there are gaps, and the gaps are in exactly the areas where commercial applications are most likely to demand specific behaviors. The second is that anti-fraud and anti-abuse systems are increasingly aggressive in their use of device fingerprinting. These systems were originally designed to identify clearly malicious traffic, like automated bots and known attack patterns. They have evolved to use subtle signals, including operating system, browser configuration, hardware capabilities, and network routing, as inputs to their decisions. The result is that anything unusual in your fingerprint, including running, Linux increases the probability that your traffic is treated with suspicion. The systems are not targeting Linux users specifically. They are simply treating unusual populations as riskier, and Linux is an unusual population. The third is that the commercial web has organized itself around a handful of dominant platforms, and those platforms have the resources to support a handful of dominant clients. Supporting Chrome, Edge, Safari, and Firefox on Windows and macOS covers the vast majority of commercial traffic. Supporting Linux variants additionally is extra effort for minimal additional reach. For most companies, the calculation comes out in favor of not bothering. The result is cumulative. Each individual company's decision seems reasonable. The aggregate effect on Linux users is exclusion. The fourth reason is that Linux desktop usage, while growing, remains a small fraction of the total consumer desktop market. The rising tide of Linux adoption has not yet reached the scale where commercial incentives to support it become automatic. For most of the web, Linux users are a rounding error in the user base, and rounding errors do not drive product decisions. So what can Linux users actually do? The first practical step is user agent spoofing. Most browsers allow you to send a user agent string that identifies you as using a different browser or operating system than you actually are. Setting your user agent to identify as Chrome on Windows, for example, will solve some of the friction cases where the site simply blocks unknown user agents. It will not solve the cases where sites are actually checking for specific capabilities, but it removes the easy blocking cases. Firefox has extensions like User Agent Switcher that make this configurable. Chromium-based browsers have similar capabilities. The second practical step is keeping a Windows fallback available. Many Linux users maintain either a Windows virtual machine or a separate Windows machine specifically for the use cases that do not work on Linux. This is, frankly, a concession to the current state of the web, but it is a pragmatic one. The fallback is used for banking, government services, streaming, and whatever specific applications do not work on Linux natively. Everything else stays on Linux. This dual environment approach works well for many users, though it does mean paying for or maintaining a Windows license you might not otherwise want. The third practical step is persistent advocacy. When a site blocks you or degrades your experience because you are using Linux, report it. Complain to customer service. File bug reports with site operators. Use alternative providers where available, and tell the providers you are not using that this is why. Individual complaints do not change the world, but aggregated complaints, over time, do shift the priorities of product teams. The Linux community's ability to improve this situation depends, in part, on being visible and vocal when problems occur. The fourth practical step is contributing to or supporting the open source projects that address these issues. The Linux desktop ecosystem is maintained by a small number of developers, often working on limited budgets. Supporting projects like Mozilla, the KDE and GNOME desktop environments, and specific tools like the AppArmor and Flatpak projects is a meaningful way to strengthen the infrastructure that Linux users depend on. This is not charity, it is enlightened self-interest. The tools you depend on only exist because someone funds their development. The fifth practical step for the long term is to push for regulatory attention to this issue. The European Union has been willing to regulate the behavior of dominant technology platforms in ways that affect how consumers are treated. If the current trend of Linux exclusion continues, it is the kind of issue that could become a regulatory concern, particularly in the context of the Digital Markets Act and similar frameworks. Linux users and open source advocates more broadly can push for regulatory frameworks that ensure the open web remains accessible to users, regardless of the operating system they choose to run. This is slow work. It is also, based on the European experience, effective work. The broader point I want to make is that the slow exclusion of Linux users from parts of the commercial web is not an accident. It is the result of specific decisions by specific companies, made for specific reasons. Those decisions can be reversed, but reversing them requires making the case that supporting Linux is worth the effort. Making that case requires Linux users to be a visible, valuable, and vocal population. The more Linux users there are, the more obvious the value becomes. The more Linux users complain, the more obvious the problem becomes. The more Linux users organize, through advocacy groups and regulatory submissions, the more force the case carries. None of this is a quick fix. Linux users in 2026 are going to experience more friction than Linux users in 2020 did. But the situation is not static. The long-term trajectory depends on what the Linux community does, collectively, to make itself visible and to insist on better treatment. Every small action, from filing a complaint with a bank, to contributing to a Firefox bug report, to writing a message to your elected representative about platform neutrality, is a step in the direction of an internet that remains open. Subscribe for the next video, which covers the specific tools and configurations that Linux users can apply to minimize the friction they encounter on the commercial web, including recommended browser extensions, specific user agent configurations, and the VPN and proxy setups that help bypass the worst of the discrimination. And in the comments, tell me about your worst recent experience being blocked or degraded because you were using Linux. I read everyone, and I am building a list of the most frequently complained about sites to highlight in future content. Visibility is leverage.